Hello, and welcome to Pennsic University 2020. This is The Evolution of the Hebrew Language by Baracha Bat Mira V'Shlomo. I am a Jewish person mundanely. I also play a Jewish person in antiquity in the Roman Empire, somewhere before the year 300 CE. So we are going to be discussing the Hebrew language based on my personal knowledge of it. I do speak Hebrew. I'm fairly fluent. My family speaks Hebrew. None of this information is my own individual new research. This is all fairly known and established stuff, but it's stuff you may not know. So I hope you enjoy this foray into the evolution of a very interesting language. We are going to be discussing who uses Hebrew, when, why, how the language has changed over time in some interesting ways, and of course, how we can incorporate its use into the SCA and our persona play. So there's actually quite a lot of options for that. And hopefully you'll learn something really cool and have a good time. You will not be learning how to speak Hebrew in this class. That is my other class about Hebrew grammar. But you will learn some cool facts about this language from antiquity until the very beginning of the modern era. So we are going to get started. As you may suspect, some of the people who use Hebrew are the Jews. This is a map of the Jewish diaspora from the year 70 until the year 500, so fairly late antiquity. The year 70 is the year that the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and this is the beginning of the global diaspora. The Romans were not the first empire in the Middle East. Far from it. You had the Greeks before them, you had the Assyrians, the Seleucids, plenty of folks who marched through that area. And there were Jewish diaspora groups established in Babylon, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Lebanon, well before the Romans marched into town, but they were limited to the Eastern Mediterranean for the most part. When it comes to the destruction of the temple in the year 70, this is the beginning of the modern global Jewish diaspora as we know it. Due to the Romans, you have Jewish communities set up not just in the Eastern Mediterranean, but all over the Roman world, all over North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, Southern Europe, and then into Central and eventually Northern and Eastern Europe as well. And this is a process that, as you can see from the map, carries on for the first couple of centuries until the end of the late antiquity era. Where Jews go, they take the language and culture with them. So Hebrew is being spoken in all of these communities. Diaspora itself is, of course, a Greek word that means scattered, which is a fairly accurate way of depicting what happened to a formally centralized ethnic group scattered to the four winds. Now, the second map is a little more complex. This goes to more or less the end of period, 1600. And this is where the SCA, for the most part, draws its line. During this entire time period, this map shows you about 500 years worth. You have a lot of moving around within Europe and the Mediterranean. It's not just a matter of pulling in and establishing a community. Often these communities came under attack, and both individuals and entire communities were uprooted and forced to leave. And that, of course, means that you have a lot of cultural movement and dissemination throughout Europe, throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the Middle East. One particularly famous example is, of course, the expulsion of Jews from Spain by the Inquisition in the year 1492, and then only a few years later, again in 1497. This mass expulsion of Sephardi Jews generally went to the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. But they also went to other places in Europe, including Italy, England, France, and this is fairly standard. A fun fact is that plenty of Ashkenazim also moved around. So none of this is static. All of this is moving all over the place. So you're not looking at discrete communities. You're looking at a series of movements throughout the entire SCA period, almost 2,000 years. Now, of course, with migration comes new linguistic constructs. What does that mean? You have the creation of new syncretic languages, which is influenced by Hebrew, but based upon whatever the host language is. arguably the most famous Jewish diasporic non-Hebrew language is Yiddish, which is Judeo-German, but it's certainly not the only one. You also have Judeo-Espanol or Ladino, Judeo-Greek, Judeo-Portuguese, Judeo-Malay. These languages are very many and very diverse. Most of these languages are extinct. They're not being spoken, they're not being used. Some are dead, which means that they are still spoken, but not as a native tongue. Some are in the process of dying. We are not covering these languages. It's just too broad a topic. But what we can say is that the language of the host country also influenced how Hebrew was used and pronounced in these local Jewish communities. These different types of accents, these different types of Hebrew still exist. The way Ashkenazim will speak Hebrew, especially if they're coming from Europe, is going to be a little bit different in pronunciation than Sephardi Hebrew. Sephardi Hebrew is the primary influence on modern Israeli Hebrew as far as pronunciation goes. So these distinctions still exist to a certain extent. Hebrew itself is not an Indo-European language. It's an Afro-Asiatic language, and it's a Semitic language. More specifically, it is from the Canaanite language family. It is the only one of that language family still spoken. So that's pretty cool. It's arguably the most successful revival of a dead language. It never ceased being spoken. It wasn't not in use, but for a while it was no longer natively spoken. It was no longer a community's primary native language, but it was still being used until its revival as a native spoken tongue in the 19th century by Ben Yehuda. So that is already quite an interesting step in and out of use in that manner. Hebrew died out as a spoken native language sometime in late antiquity, somewhere between 200 and 400 CE. But it continued to be used as a liturgical language and a language of commerce, literature, and general connection amongst the scattered Jewish communities, again, well through the modern era until its revival as a spoken native language in the 19th century. The oldest known Hebrew inscription was found in a potsherd in an archaeological excavation in 2008, about 20 kilometers south of modern Jerusalem. That potsherd is 3,000 years old, and it's a very old form of Hebrew, and it's honestly difficult to distinguish it from Phoenician or Proto-Canaanite, which is a very closely related language. There is an even older inscription called the Gezer calendar, so it's part of a calendar, and that dates to the 10th century BCE. This is the Iron Age, assumed to be the time of Kings David and Solomon. Archaeologists are still arguing over if the Gezer calendar is in Phoenician or Proto-Canaanite or has already split into Paleo-Hebrew. So you are looking at a very long-lived language family. Now, by the time it's about the 6th century BCE is when Aramaic becomes the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the general international language of that region. And occupied Palestine is not at all an exception to the rule. So this became a very standard language in use alongside Hebrew. Hellenistic Israel, so first the Greeks and then the Romans, was a multilingual society. Many Jews in the area are speaking both Hebrew and Aramaic as their native tongues. Many elites, many educated people, folks involved in trade and commerce are also speaking Greek, which is very, very typical for the Eastern Roman Empire. Aramaic, as a very closely related Semitic language, itself had an impact on Hebrew's use and evolution. A lot of Jewish prayers are in Aramaic, not Hebrew. So a lot of times, if I'm doing my daily prayers, I will switch back and forth between these languages without a thought, just because this is the language that it's in. The Gemara, the Talmud, is written in a specific Aramaic dialect, a Jewish Babylonian dialect. That dialect is no longer spoken. It is very different from the Aramaic dialect that still exists in Lebanon all the way through Kurdistan. That is a different dialect of Aramaic. They are not, in fact, mutually intelligible. Ask me how I know this after class. Some archaeologists will distinguish between how these different languages were used. Some will say that these different languages had different roles in Hebrew society in Hellenistic Israel. So there is a trilingual scenario where a lot of people are speaking all of these languages, where Hebrew was the local mother tongue with ties to Israel's history, its origins, the language of the religion. Aramaic, of course, was the standard international language of the Middle East, and Greek, of course, was another international languages, particularly with the rest of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, other archaeologist William Schneidwind argues in particular that after the Persian period, the religious importance of Hebrew grew during the Hellenistic period, and Hebrew survived as a vernacular language, even though its grammar and its writing system becomes more and more influenced by Aramaic over time. Greek became the language of government, Hebrew the language of prayer, and Aramaic was the language of legal contracts and trade. Yet other archaeologists, such as Spolsky, will say that there is a geographic pattern to the use of these three languages in Israel by the time it gets to the year 0 and soon after. That Judeo-Aramaic was mainly used in the Galilee, Greek was mostly used in the former colonies around governmental centers, and Hebrew monolingualism still persisted primarily in the villages of Judea, what is now the modern West Bank. So there are different scenarios that scholars will posit for the use of a trilingual Hellenistic Israel, and there are merits to each of these scenarios. Now, the rules of Hebrew, of course, do change over time, but as far as modern usage is concerned, by the time it gets to 400, Hebrew is no longer in use as a daily vernacular, though it is still used in ways of intercommunity communication and, of course, liturgy. By the time it's the medieval period, you already have regional dialects emerging, which is quite fascinating. Of the very many regional dialects that exist, the most important is Masoretic Hebrew, also known as Tiberian Hebrew, because it was developed in Tiberias. And this evolved between the 7th and 10th centuries. This specific dialect influences how people pronounce biblical and modern Hebrew to this day. It is profoundly important. Now, during the Golden Age in Spain, only a little bit later, during the 8th and 12th centuries, is when grammarians nailed down the rules of Hebrew, the specific grammar rules, grammar charts, the stuff that we use in school. They were often influenced by grammarians of classical Arabic. So you have yet more influence from another related Semitic language. So during this time period when folks are nailing this down, you also concurrently see an explosion in Hebrew poetry and piyutim. And this spreads across the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, France, and then throughout the rest of Europe as well. One particularly important grammarian is Ibn Ezra. Many Jews are familiar with this name because he also wrote very important and well-known commentaries on the Torah. Who speaks Hebrew? We've been talking about Jewish communities a lot, so it's fairly safe to say that if you or your persona are Jewish, this is a great opportunity to work Hebrew into your persona play. Not every Jew is going to be fluent in Hebrew. That's true today. It was true 500 years ago. It was true 2,000 years ago. But you're still looking at a lot of people who are familiar with it, not just the elites, but anyone with some sort of education. This language was used to bind and unite a far-flung diaspora, and this enabled communication in all matters. Contracts, marriage contracts, letters, science discussions, medicine discussions, discussions of halakha or Jewish law are all conducted in Hebrew. The first printing press in Safed in 1577 printed Hebrew books. They're only doing that if there's a market for Hebrew text. So enough people are speaking Hebrew in period that you can actually market product to them. But plenty of Christians are learning Hebrew too, especially members of the clergy, especially if they want to get a hold of texts that maybe weren't completely translated, or if they want to do their own translation. This was hardly unusual. Now, it wasn't as widespread as priestly study of Latin. Latin similarly allowed priests from far-flung locales to have a common language in which to converse. But this does mean that if you or your persona are situated in a place where you have contact with a Jewish community, which is not unreasonable, you can work Hebrew into your persona play, regardless of your own background or your persona's background. So there's a lot of opportunity here to work in this language into your persona play if you so desire. Really, the sky's the limit. Go for it. Going back to the evolution of the language, though, we've been talking about the evolution of the language itself and who used it and how it was used. But there's also the evolution of the alphabet. The Hebrew script that you see today is not the same alphabet that has always been used, though, as is common in Semitic languages, those alphabets have always read from right to left. The earliest known Hebrew script is actually a variant of the Phoenician alphabet, and that emerged around 800 BCE. The Samaritans, which is a closely related ethno-religious community, also use an alphabet that is derived from this script. It's different from modern Hebrew, but it's related. The block script that you will see today if you look at a Torah or if you visit Israel is called Kitav Ashuri. That means literally Assyrian writing. That is derived from the Assyrian Empire. This also had its origins in the Phoenician alphabet, but it was developed in a somewhat different manner. It was picked up by the Jewish community in Babylon around 600 BCE, and it was used in speaking Assyrian Aramaic. And it was just picked up and then dispersed through the rest of the Jewish communities in and around the Eastern Mediterranean. The square style that you'll see in modern Hebrew today reached its form some 300 years later, so 300 BCE. Hebrew looks the way, more or less, it looks today. There are no true vowels in the Hebrew language. In order to show what vowels are being used, there is a development called nikud, which just means dots. These little dots are vowel marks. They were developed much later in the early Middle Ages. So any modern Hebrew that you see today, whether it's a children's book or the sign in Ben Gurion Airport, is going to be legible to someone in period. And that's pretty cool. This is a chart of PaleoHebrew next to modern Hebrew and a English alphabet so that you can sort of understand what you're looking at. And this is the oldest form of Hebrew that we know about. This alphabet is almost exactly the same as the Phoenician alphabet. Now, what is notable here, both in Paleo and modern Hebrew, is that there's no such thing as capital letters, and that persists throughout the development of Hebrew. This is a Samaritan Hebrew alphabet. You'll notice that it's very similar to the chart that we just saw. So you can see how the Samaritan Hebrew alphabet developed from very similar roots. Below it, of course, are modern Hebrew block script, Kitav Ashuri, and below that, English letters with phonetic value. So if you would like to learn this chart, that is more than possible for any English speaker, if you so desire. Last but certainly not least, this is Kitav Ashuri. This is what Hebrew script looked like well before the year 300 BC. It already looked like this, though it did not yet have the little vowel marks that we're used to. And again, you have a pronunciation key underneath each letter, so it is more than possible to learn which letter has which sound value. I mentioned before that there are no capital letters, but there are a few letters that you'll notice have an ending form. This form of the letter only comes when it finishes a word. It's called sofit, which in Hebrew just means ending. It only comes into play when the letter finishes a word. This is very different from Arabic. If there are any Arabic speakers in this class, you'll know that Arabic letters change their form all the time. They have a different form when they're alone. They have a different form when they're in the beginning of the word, the middle of the word, or the end of the word. And that really doesn't happen in Hebrew. There's only 5 letters that have an ending form at all. So it's a little bit easier to memorize. These are nikud. These are the little dots that show you what the vowel symbols are. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart. I will be spending more time on it in my other class, which is about Introduction to Hebrew Grammar and Vocabulary. Just to go through it really fast, the kamatz, starting on the right, upper right, the kamatz is an ah sound, patach is an ah sound, sere is an a sound, segol is an eh sound. Shwa is an I sound, but that's a little bit misleading. Modern Hebrew grammar will mostly have it contract the sound, so it's very, very short. A cholam, which is that little dot on top, is an O sound. Second row, you'll see that there's a combination of these sounds together that actually has a grammatical value. Chataf kamatz still sounds like a regular kamatz. It sounds like an ah. Chataf patach still sounds like an ah. The little shva next to it indicates very subtle grammatical changes, so we don't have to worry about it for this class. Chirik is my favorite sound. It's an E sound, kind of like a Y in certain words, an E sound. Chataf segol, similarly, just still sounds like a regular segol. It's an eh. Kubutz, which is those three diagonal dots, is also an U sound. And a shuruk, which is a dot in the middle of the letter, is yet another U sound. Why are there so many U sounds? The answer is grammar. We will go into it later. It honestly isn't very detailed. You can learn how to speak Hebrew fluently and never know why there are three different U sounds. Just know that there are. So if you come across it, now you know. This is a script called Rashi Script. Just like English has a cursive form and a print form, Hebrew also has cursive forms. This is named for Rashi, which is the name of a very famous scholar and commentator, but he never actually used this cursive himself. Rather, it became very famous because it was used to print his commentaries on Torah and Talmud. This is, in fact, a typeface that is based on writing from 15th century Spain. So it's a late period typeface. And this, of course, was easily the most popular typeface with which to print Rashi's commentaries. The first version of his commentaries printed with this script was done on February the 5th, 1475 in Reggio Calabria by a Sephardi Jew named Abraham Garton. Now, there were earlier printed editions of Rashi's commentaries in 1469 and 1472, but they were using block script, not this print cursive script. This is not the only cursive that exists. Solitreo was a different Sephardi cursive script that predates this, and it is still used to write Ladino. It looks very similar, but it's slightly different. This is all the information that I just told you about. Now, this is modern Hebrew cursive. You have the block script Kitav Ashuri on top and modern Hebrew cursive below. This is an Ashkenazi cursive style, but it is actually developed from an earlier Sephardi Solitreo script. So again, very, very similar to each other. This was developed a little bit earlier in the 13th century. And this is how people write letters to each other today. I learned how to write this cursive in grade school and I hated it, but this is how people will write to each other. It is very unusual for a modern Hebrew speaker to write in block script. We would write in cursive and we would type in block script, very similar to how lots of folks learned to write English. This concludes our Evolution of Hebrew Language class. I hope you had fun. Please feel free to email me questions or comments. Toda raba lehitraot. Thank you very much and see you next time.